Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I want to rank all of the classic books that I read in 2021. I feel like I should preface this video because if you're new here, you might not know this, but we have kittens, so if you hear weird, loud thumping noises, it's kittens. So, I went through and I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to do a top 10 classics video or rank all of the classics that I read. And I decided on all. I had done like a poll on Instagram and some people said that they would rather see a top 10. So I will leave a timestamp down in the description in case you are only interested in a top 10, but I'm gonna rank them all. I did not include middle grade in this list because I am doing a separate middle grade video, but I'm not gonna rank all the middle grade I read. I'm just gonna rank the top 10, I think, or somewhere around that range for middle grade. So not including middle grade classics, I read 34 classics in the year 2021. My goal was to read 12, to read one a month, so I far exceeded my goal. We may have some differences of opinion in here and what constitutes a classic, and that's okay. So some of these may not be considered classic to you, but I was kind of going by like how old they are for some of them. I think the newest book on this list was written maybe in the 60s. But if they're not classics in terms of, being 100 years old or older, whatever, they are considered classics in their genre. So that's probably why I included them on this list. But I feel like everyone has a different definition of what a classic even is. So we're just gonna go with it. So I'm gonna start out actually with my DNFs of the year. Some of these were DNF'd because they were truly terrible, and some of them were time constraints and whatever. So at the bottom of this list, this is the bottom no matter what, whether it was a DNF or not, but it was a DNF. It was Absent in the Spring. This was written by Agatha Christie under the pen name Mary Westmacott, which is what she wrote her romances under, and this was the first Mary Westmacott and the only one still that I have read. I hated this book so much. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about things that I hated about or liked about books because this video is going to be forever long with 34 books in it anyway. But I DNF'd this one about a quarter of the way through because I just found some of the content highly problematic. And then I read spoilers for the ending and realized I made the right choice. Nothing improved. So that is the bottom of the list for sure. But then I have two DNFs that are actually quite good books that I just didn't finish. The first one of which is The Iliad. This was actually on my classics TBR for 2021 and I just couldn't do it. And it wasn't like a fault of The Iliad itself. I just think that I was not in the right headspace to read something that required so much of me and so much focus and brain power, particularly because I was trying to read it in December and I was really busy in December. So I think that's why that one didn't work out. I do want to give it a go at another point. I also DNF'd Crime and Punishment, and this is like one of my favorite books of all time. So it's not a reflection on the book at all. I was just trying to read it during Victober and I had way overscheduled myself. So I got 3/4 of the way through that one before I DNF'd it. It's still a 5-star book though, and it's perfect and just one of the best books of all time. But I had to make some decisions. And so I DNF'd that one because I had read it before. Okay, so from here on out, all these other books are books that I did complete. So the bottom one on this list is Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith. This is a newer book in terms, I think it was published in like the 50s or the 60s, and it's a thriller, and I think I gave it like 3.5 stars when I read it, but like the more space I have from it, the more I dislike it. Next is a similar situation, Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. This is considered a classic of fantasy, and there are elements that I liked about it, but again, the more space I have from it, the more I'm just like, I really don't like that book anymore. The next one is The Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne. Apparently the writer of Winnie the Pooh also wrote an adult mystery, which is just fascinating to me. This book was fine. It was okay. It was very predictable, predicted the ending, so it was just kind of lackluster. Next up was Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day, and I was really expecting to love this one, but there were elements to it that were kind of off-putting to me. I really did like the ending and felt like that redeemed the story a little bit, but it wasn't what I was expecting. The next book is Eugene Onegin by Alexander Pushkin. This remains the only Pushkin that I have read, and it was very difficult for me to read, to be honest. I am not a huge poetry reader, and this is an entire story in poetry. It's like, I want to say it's like 150, 200 pages, something like that, all written in rhyming verse, which makes it difficult for me to like focus on the story aspect of it. I would be interested in reading a different translation than the one that I read, because the one that I read kept the same rhyming structure, even in terms of how many syllables were in each line that Pushkin did, which is quite a feat when you're translating something. But apparently it wasn't the most accurate of translations in terms of capturing some of the elements of the story itself. So I would be interested to read another translation and see if this ranks higher. The next book on this list was A Room with a View, which I did not really love when I read it, but the more space that I've had from it, the more I actually like kept thinking about it. So I think this is a book I would enjoy more upon a reread than I did the first read. The next book on this list is Crocodile on the Sandbank, which is a more recent read. I read this in October, I think. And it was cute and fun, but there just wasn't really very much substance to it. So it's not one that I'm going to remember forever, even though I probably will continue on with the series. In the same vein, another mystery on here is Murder in Mesopotamia by Agatha Christie. This I read earlier this year, and it was fine. There were elements to it that I didn't love, and it just wasn't super memorable for me. It also still has that same setting as Crocodile on the Sandbank, of like an archaeological dig site mystery. Kittens. And maybe that's just not my favorite setting. I don't know. The next on this list is The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. This is actually the first Hardy I've read that I felt kind of meh about. I love Hardy's writing so very much. And Tess of the D'Urbervilles is one of my favorite books ever of all time. I loved it. I love Far from the Madding Crowd. I had a very visceral reaction against Jude the Obscure. And then The Mayor of Casterbridge was just kind of like, it was okay. So I guess Hardy has run the whole gamut in my books so far. Next up on this list is Bleak House, which I did not expect to be kind of in the middle of my classics list. When I chose this book to read in 2021, I thought it would be at the top of the list. But this is actually probably one of my biggest disappointments of this year, because I had really high expectations. And it is in fact the least favorite Dickens I've ever read, which it's really surprising because so many people said it was just their favorite, but didn't like the way one of the narratives was written. And I know Dickens has a reputation for being verbose, but this book was like over the top bloated in my opinion. But it also did make me cry, and I loved the ending. So it wasn't bad, it just wasn't the best. Another book that I didn't think would be in the middle of this list is The Idiot by Dostoevsky. I loved every Dostoevsky I had read up until the point of reading The Idiot. And then The Idiot just kind of just wasn't my favorite. And it was because of the ending. I expected something a bit more redemptive and lovely from Dostoevsky than what I got from this book. So that's why it's lower. Up until the point of the ending, it was in the running to be one of my favorite Dostoevskys because I just loved the way it was written. Next, you could classify this as a middle grade, but I would not probably give this to very young children. And that's Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. This book is fun, and it's definitely like whimsical and childish in a way, but it definitely has content that I would not just pass off to a kid, particularly in terms of the racism in the book. And it was cute and it was fun and I enjoyed it and I laughed a lot, but not a favorite. The next book on this list is Lord Edgware Dies by Agatha Christie. This was a 5-star book, so it's kind of interesting that I have some 5-star books that are not at the top, but this was 5-star for Christie. And I really loved it, and I loved the banter between Poirot and Hastings, and I did not guess the mystery, so I enjoyed that. But it just didn't stick with me like some of the other books on this list. The next book on the list is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And if you've been here for a while, it was kind of towards the beginning of my booktube journey that I read this book. And it was during a reading vlog, my very first reading vlog, that I was doing a reading challenge, and this fit one of the prompts. So I will link that video here so you can hear my in-depth thoughts on it, but I had a very difficult time with this book. Parts of it were brilliant, beautifully written. Parts of it were hilarious and so much fun. It has a much more cohesive plot than Tom Sawyer, but the racism in the book was really hard to get past. And I think that if this had been more redemptive, then I think it would have ended up much higher on the list. But I can see why people call this like the great American novel, because it is brilliantly written. Next on the list is actually another 5-star book, but you know, sometimes, like I said, sometimes books stick with you differently over time. So that's Daddy Longlegs by Jean Webster. This is an epistolary novel about a young girl who's writing to her benefactor, and it was just really, not only was it like sweet, but it was funny. It was really well written, and I generally hate epistolary novels, so I'm really surprised at how much I enjoyed this one. The next book on this list is The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and oh geez, this is probably the weirdest book that I read from this whole year. Maybe one of the weirdest books I've ever read in my life. And at the time that I was reading, I was like, I don't even know if I like this, but I can't stop thinking about this book. I read it in August and I still think about it all the time. It just really, really stayed with me. It was really brilliantly written, and it's one that I look forward to rereading in the future. The next book on this list was a reread, and that's Silas Marner by George Eliot. This is a book I very, very vividly remember my father reading out loud to me when I was probably 10 or 11. And it would have been my introduction to Victorian literature and one of my introductions to adult classics. So it was a very nostalgic read, very sweet. There was only like one kind of complaint I had about it, and that was the time jump. I wish we had had a little bit more time with the characters in between the time jump. The next book on this list is I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. This was the first Dodie Smith I'd ever read, and I loved this book. It's another one that I just keep thinking about. I read it in May, and I think about it all the time and how much I really want to reread it. So I really, really enjoyed it. It's not one I've heard a lot of people talk about. It is basically like a 16-year-old girl's journal for 6 months of her life. And so it doesn't have like kind of a normal story arc, I guess, because it's just following her life for those 6 months, and her falling in love for the first time. And it's really good. I really liked it. The next book on this list is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. This was a reread. I am on a mission to reread all of Jane Austen's books, because the only one that I have reread in recent days before this year was Pride and Prejudice, and I have not reread any of the others, and I don't remember very much about them. But I do remember Sense and Sensibility being my favorite Jane Austen out of them all in high school. And so I reread it this year and actually surprisingly gave it 4 stars. There were a lot of things about it I didn't like. It's kind of surprising. Definitely will not be my favorite Jane Austen going forward, but I did like it. So I'm not saying I didn't like it. It's still pretty high up on this list. The next book on this list is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I had never seen the movie, never read the book, and I read it earlier this year, and it's wonderful. You should read it. If you haven't read it, you need to read it. It's beautiful, it's heart-wrenching, it's basically kind of like a perfect book, honestly. When I finished it, I'm like, there's not even one criticism I could give for this book. So it's really short too. So if you're looking for a short classic to squeeze in, I definitely recommend The Outsiders. All right, guys, we are at the top 10. So these are the books that I loved the very, very most this year. We are kicking off with number 10, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This was my very first Shirley Jackson and still my only Shirley Jackson novel. I have read a couple of her short stories afterwards, but it's my only novel. And I read this book in January. This book I gave 4 stars, so it's kind of funny that it ended up in the top spot above books that I gave 5 stars. But my gracious, this book, like, I still think about it all the time. Like, you're probably seeing a theme here of books that, like, maybe I didn't give as high of a rating at the time, but they kind of are ending up higher on the list than I might have thought because I continue to think about them. They have really stuck in my brain, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle is one of those. This is a gothic story about it's kind of about a family, but we mainly follow 2 sisters and their uncle. The rest of their family has died through poisoning and mysterious circumstances, and it's great. It's got like that really good slow burn gothic feel, and I'm a fan. The next book on this list is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This one was a surprise too. I was not expecting to love this as much as I did. This is one that I feel like pretty much everybody knows the plot of this one because it's been around for a really long time. It is a book that I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everyone because it's very negative in a lot of ways. Like, you don't have likable characters. Everyone is kind of hedonistic, and it really just shows the emptiness of that and communicates that in a really good way. But what really put this over the top for me was not even so much the storyline, it was the writing. Like, I was completely enamored by Oscar Wilde's writing, and oh my goodness, like, it's like the epitome of like the perfect prose for me. The next book on this list could also be considered a middle grade, but we're saying it's not because I need to include it on this list, and it's one that I don't think younger middle grade might not like as much because it is Victorian, so it's a little maybe harder to read. And I think that everyone should read this one, and it's Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. I'm in love with this book, and I didn't have super high expectations going into it because I knew the story, but it felt so like nostalgic and wonderful, and I think it's because I was familiar with the story. It's just wonderful. I loved it so much. Book number 7 on this list is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Oh my goodness. What do you even say about this book? What do you even say about it? It's so beautiful. It's so hard to read too at times. Not in terms of like readability. The readability is good, but Victor Hugo goes off on like massive side tangents, which is why this book is not higher on the list than it is, because the actual story itself is just unbelievable, wonderful, so good. But he loves to go off on tangents about historical things which aren't even factual. So I don't even know what the point of that is. And then statements on socioeconomic things and how Hugo thinks they should have been done and how things could be fixed. There's a whole section on slang and how that came to be. I still don't know what the purpose of that was. But yeah, so I read the unabridged version. So if the unabridged version intimidates you, I encourage you to read an abridged version because it cuts a lot of that out and gives you more of just the story, which is just beautiful, wonderful, and I loved it so much. Book number 6 is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This was the only Jane Austen of her major novels that I had not read before, and I loved it so much. It is definitely a new favorite. It is just, it's marvelous. It's so funny. It's very like tongue-in-cheek in a lot of ways with that classic Jane Austen humor, but I just love it. I love the love interest. He's like my favorite love interest, and his relationship with the protagonist reminds me in some ways of my husband and I in terms of how opposite they are, how sensible he is, and how dramatic and maybe over trusting she can be. I see a lot of myself in Catherine Morland and a lot of my husband's in Henry Tilney. And Henry Tilney is completely underrated. I feel like he is the best Austen love interest. He's wonderful. Book number 5 was a reread, and that's Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This was my favorite Dickens for forever, and then recently I'm like, is it still my favorite? I haven't read it in like 10 years. I picked it up, and easily 5 stars. Such a wonderful book. So accessible for Dickens, I think, because it doesn't quite have as much of a meandering plot line and weird, crazy plot points that are so unconnected that then become interconnected. This one's not so much that way. And so I feel like it's a really good starting point for people with Dickens. I made a whole video about it. You should go watch it if you haven't seen it. And if you're on the fence about reading Charles Dickens and you're just not sure how you feel about it, watch my video about Great Expectations and maybe I can talk you into giving it a try. Book number 4 is a cheater. It's a tie. I have 2 books together in this spot because I love them equally and they're part of the same series. It was a reread and I read them both out loud to my daughter this year, and that is Anne of Green Gables and Anne of Avonlea. Oh my word. I hadn't reread these since I was probably a little older than my daughter. I think I was 12 the last time I remember reading them, or maybe like 14. I don't know, somewhere in the 12 to 14 range. I had reread the Anne books and they're flawless. They're amazing. I love Anne's optimism about life, and it is probably one of the most quotable of Ella Montgomery's heroines, I think. I hope to continue the series with my daughter, but we did read the first 2 and just absolutely fell in love. Book number 3 is The Great Force by C.S. Lewis. This is one of the last C.S. Lewis's fictional works that I had not read. I still have I think one more, maybe more, but the only one I can think of that I still have not read is The Pilgrim's Regress. But anyways, The Great Divorce. It is a plot that's really kind of difficult to describe. So basically, in the book, C.S. Lewis has a dream that he gets on this bus that basically takes him to heaven, and when he goes there, he learns some things, encounters some things, and has George MacDonald as like his guide. It's so strange, but it's also so incredible, and there's such a depth to it, and it's one of those books that I know that the more that I reread it, the more I will get out of it and the different things I will see. And it was just so insightful, so beautifully written. I just love C.S. Lewis in general, and I love his insights. I feel like he has ways of explaining things that are just so amazing. This one very easily made the top 3. Book number 2 is technically a novella, but I'm including it anyway, and that's The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. The only other Tolstoy I'd read up to this point was Anna Karenina, and this book is very different from Anna Karenina, both in length and in plot. So this one follows a man, Ivan Ilyich, who finds out that he is dying, and it's just kind of his grappling with end of life of what does it mean to actually live your life well, to be able to look back on your life without regret, to know that you've actually lived your life to the fullest. And it's just a very deep examination of that. I thought it was really beautifully done. When I finished that book, I stared at the wall for probably a good 5 or 10 minutes because it just felt so profound to me, and I hadn't really read a book that dealt with end of life in that way. So really good. So if you're interested in reading any Russian classics and you're scared of the size, pick up The Death of Ivan Ilyich because it's very short and very wonderful. Here we go, guys. We're going to talk about our number 1 book now. And I'm wondering if any of you can guess what it is, because there's a book that I read recently that I have not mentioned yet. So, book number 1 was easily Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Oh my gosh. I love this book so much. There aren't even words to tell you how much I loved it. I had known the plot because I've seen the 1990s movie and enjoyed it, but the book blew the movies out of the water, and it was just beautifully written. It was so cozy, so nostalgic. There's so much wisdom in it. And the more that I read it, when I was younger, we all have the sisters that are our favorite sister in the book. And I think a lot of people choose Jo. Beth was always my favorite sister. And reading it, Beth still is my favorite sister. And then Meg was the sister that I related to the most and felt like I was the most like, but I wanted it to be more like Beth. But having read the book, the person that I actually want to be like is Marmee. Oh my goodness. And maybe it's because I'm a mother, but as a mother, she is everything that I want to be as a mother. And I just loved it so much. If you want to hear more of my gushing thoughts, I will link my reading vlog, the one where I read the majority of this book. I think I started it in one Vlogmas video, and then the next Vlogmas video I read from like chapter 10 on. So that is like basically an entire video of me gushing about how much I loved Little Women. So it's interesting because when I was trying to rank these, there were some that like were kind of interchangeable, where like maybe on a different day I could switch them around and be like, okay, actually no, maybe this is this number and this one's this number. But there is absolutely like no question at any point that Little Women would be number one once I had read it. And actually the top three are really firm. Like there is no way any of those would be switched around. Like those are very easily my top three. Actually, my top 10 was really, really easy to choose, which I was really surprised by. I thought that I would agonize over that. And there are a few points where some of the things could get switched around, like Anne of Green Gables and Great Expectations. Those are pretty close. And I actually did flip-flop Les Mis and Treasure Island before I did this video. I had those in a different order, but the top 10 were like very, very firmly the top 10, and there was like never a question of which books belonged on that. It was the middle books that I was just like, I don't know about this. So it was pretty interesting to rank these. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. What were some of your favorite classics that you read this year? Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.